I first noticed something was off on a crisp autumn evening, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and wet leaves. Our home, tucked at the edge of the forest, had always been a place of refuge for me and Rachel. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to retreat from the world, a world we'd built together over 10 years of marriage. But that evening, something in the air felt different. I could hear her, though I couldn't see her yet. She was in the living room, her voice tinged with that familiar sweetness carrying down the hallway. But there was something in the tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was too light, too carefree. That's how you sound when you're hiding something, isn't it? I thought, my chest tightening as I stood frozen in, the doorway, the floor beneath me creaking with my weight. My own reflection in the hallway mirror caught my attention, and I almost didn't recognize the man who stared back. Dark circles under his eyes, hands trembling ever so slightly. How long had I been like this? I lingered there, my mind racing while she laughed, a sound that used to warm me like sunlight on a winter morning. Now it felt foreign, a brittle shell, perhaps, that cracked with every laugh that wasn't meant for me. She was on the phone again. I couldn't see the face, but I could tell by the way she stood, leaning against the couch, her back to me, that there was something between her and the person on the other end of that line, something hidden. "I miss you too," she said, her voice dropping, soft but heated. "Miss you?" My breath hitched. Who the hell was she talking to? I stepped closer, as quietly as I could, moving with a practiced grace I'd learned over the years of living in this house, but each step felt heavier than the last. My heart drummed in my chest and I swallowed thickly, fighting the knot in my throat. I stood just out of view, listening, waiting. "I don't know how long I can keep doing this," she continued, her voice so tender it cut into me. Keep doing what? The thought spiraled through my mind, a wild, maddening rush. Keep lying? I should have turned around and walked away. Should have given myself the space to think. But something in me couldn't. My feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the living room where she stood with the phone pressed against her ear, her fingers brushing over her lips as if searching. For the words, she couldn't speak aloud. "This isn't real," I told myself. Though the words tasted bitter, it can't be real, but there it was, plain as day, the proof that had been hiding in the shadows all along. Her laughter was no longer a comfort. It was a lie wrapped in sweetness. She was no longer the woman I had married, and I was no longer the man who trusted her without question. I took another step forward, finally within her line of sight. Her gaze flickered toward me, and for a split second, I saw something fleeting, before she masked it with a smile. "Hi, babe. You're home early." Her tone shifted, but the sincerity was absent. Why didn't she just hang up? I wondered, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who was that?" The words slipped out before I could stop them, and there was no denying the hardness in my voice. Her smile faltered, and her fingers tightened around the phone, though she didn't end the call. Instead, she gave me a sheepish look, the kind she used when she didn't want to answer but didn't know how to avoid it. "That was—" She hesitated, eyes darting toward the door as if the walls would offer her an escape. "Who was it, Rachel?" I pressed, my voice steady but thick with the weight of too many unsaid words. She swallowed. "It was just a friend. Someone I've been talking to for a while." A friend. The words hit me like a slap to the face. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She took a breath, then slowly set the phone down on the table, her eyes not meeting mine. There was no more laughter, no more sweetness in her voice, just an edge of guilt sharp enough to slice through the silence between us. "Don't," I whispered, the air thick with the sudden realization. "Don't tell me that." The truth lingered in the space between us, heavy and undeniable. She had been seeing someone. I knew it without needing to hear the full story. I should have known. I should have seen it sooner. The thought echoed through my mind, mixing with the growing rage in my chest. I turned away, walking toward the door, the world outside feeling far colder than I remembered. I needed to leave, to breathe, to escape the suffocating feeling of betrayal. But a single thought clung to my mind. How long had she been lying? And just like that, I found myself standing on the porch, my hands clenched into fists. My heart was a jagged mess of emotions, betrayal, anger, confusion, and the desperate need for answers. I stood on the porch, the cool night air stinging my skin, trying to steady the storm within me. Every breath I took seemed to burn hotter, a growing fire fueled by the betrayal that had rooted itself deep in my chest. I couldn't escape it. It clung to me, wrapping around my ribs, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I had to do something. But what? The question echoed in my mind, a maddening refrain. What was I supposed to do with this kind of hurt? This wasn't just any kind of hurt. This was a betrayal of the worst kind. It was the kind of wound that would never heal cleanly, the kind that would leave scars deeper than anything physical. I wanted to shout, to scream, to make her feel the same searing pain that had been coursing through me since I'd overheard that conversation. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't fix me. But damn it, I needed something. I needed retribution. And then it hit me. The idea was sudden, like a spark that flared in the darkness, lighting up my mind with a clarity that felt almost dangerous. If she wanted to play the part of the lover, if she thought she could get away with this treachery, then she hadn't seen the full extent of my capacity to hurt. Slowly, I turned back to the door, my hands trembling with the first glimmer of purpose. I could feel her presence inside, that aura of guilt she wore like a veil. She would be waiting for me to speak, to react, to confront her. But I wouldn't do it the way she expected. I walked through the door with quiet determination, my footsteps purposeful, echoing in the otherwise still house. The soft hum of the lights overhead did little to soften the tension between us. She was sitting on the couch now, her body turned, slightly away from me as if giving me space, or perhaps preparing herself for my anger. Her eyes met mine, but they were unreadable, clouded with guilt, with fear, and I suspected a bit of anticipation. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Rachel," I said, my voice cold, distant. I had already decided I wouldn't raise my voice, not yet. I wanted to see if I could break her without a single shout. She swallowed hard. "I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to—" But I cut her off, stepping closer to her, my hand resting on the edge of the coffee table between us. "Hurt me? Is that what you think this is about?" I leaned down slightly, my gaze never leaving hers. "You think this is just about the hurt? No, Rachel. This is about the lies. This is about what you've been doing behind my back for God knows how long." She flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. I watched her with cold precision, noting every shift, every movement that gave away her discomfort. I was savoring it. "You know what I want to know?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "How long have you been doing this? How long have you been sleeping with someone else while I've been here, thinking everything was fine?" She flinched again, harder this time, but there was no escaping the truth. Not now. Her voice cracked, but I wasn't interested in her words. She'll lie again. I reached for my phone. The sleek black screen flickered to life in my hand, a tool of cold, calculated vengeance. I unlocked it, scrolling through the recent messages. I'd done my homework. I had been watching, listening, tracking every subtle detail. There had been texts, pictures, a multitude of calls that had gone unnoticed until now. "You think I'm stupid?" I asked, my voice low, dangerous. "You think I don't know what's been happening?" the sound of her breath hitching. In her throat was almost too much to bear. She looked up at me, her face pale, the weight of the truth pressing down on her fragile composure. But I interrupted her, holding up my phone. I showed her the messages, the pictures, the conversations she thought I hadn't seen. Each one felt like a strike to my chest, each one a betrayal in its own right. "I know, Rachel," I said, the words cutting like glass. "And now you get to see how it feels." Her eyes widened as she recognized what was happening. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her, and in that moment I saw something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Fear, true fear, but it wasn't enough. I stepped back, my hands shaking with the surge of adrenaline coursing through me. The impulse to make her feel this, to make her pay, burned brighter with every second. The truth was, I had never wanted to hurt her. I had never imagined that the woman I loved could bring me to this point. But now the scales had tipped, and I wasn't sure I could stop myself from going too far. "You'll never get away with this," I said, my voice barely a murmur, but the weight of it hung in the air. She didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap, too stunned to speak, too paralyzed to move. The silence between us thickened. But this time, it wasn't the familiar silence of companionship, the kind that settled comfortably in the spaces between words. No, this silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of truth, and, more unsettlingly, the looming specter of my own intent. I could feel it creeping inside me like a cold wind, inching into every crack of my consciousness. The desire for retribution, it didn't simply reside in my mind now, but had taken root deep in my chest. In the very marrow of my bones. "This isn't who I am," I thought, my fingers tightening around my phone, the screen flickering dimly under my touch. But it doesn't matter. She deserves this. I watched her as she sat there, a trembling wreck of the woman I once knew. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her fingers white from the strain, and her lips, though parted, didn't seem capable of forming any coherent words. She didn't speak. I didn't let her. I stood, frozen, just long enough to see the cracks in her carefully constructed facade, the soft tremor in her lip, the avoidance of my gaze. And yet, the rage simmered below the surface, so close to bubbling over. "I want you to understand something," I said, my voice a quiet but deadly murmur, each syllable falling like a stone. "What you've done to me, what you've done to us, this isn't something that just disappears. This is not something I'll forgive." I let that hang in the air for a moment, letting it sink into the room, like poison filling the lungs. Her eyes flickered to mine briefly, but she quickly looked away. There was no defense. Not anymore. Not for this. I stepped closer to her, my presence closing the gap between us like an inevitable storm. Each step I took felt like it was tearing me apart, but I was past the point of no return. "You'll never get away with this," I repeated. "But this time." The words carried weight, like a promise. I watched her face flicker with something, fear, and for a moment it almost stopped me. The sight of it, that raw, exposed emotion, stirred something deep inside me, a hint of something that almost resembled empathy. But then I remembered the years, the quiet nights when I'd trusted her, when I believed she was beside me, every step of the way. She lied to me. That truth burned even brighter, and with it, the spark of my revenge reignited. "I'm going to make you see how it feels to lose everything," I whispered, and the weight of those words seemed to hang in the air like an electric charge, crackling with danger. Her eyes, wide with terror now, met mine again. But I could see the desperation. In them, the understanding that this moment wasn't about pleading or defending. She knew what was coming. She knew she had pushed me too far, and now she was about to feel the full extent of my wrath. "Please don't do this," she said, her voice shaking, though she made no attempt to stand. It was as though she was rooted to the spot by the intensity of the moment, her body paralyzed by the fear that had taken hold of her. I leaned down, my face close to hers. Her scent, once a comfort to me, now felt suffocating, too close. I could almost taste the bitterness of betrayal on my tongue. "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore," I said, my words low, dark, and laden with venom. "You had your chance. You made your choices." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small black envelope, the one I had placed there hours earlier, the one I had prepared just for this moment, the moment when I would force her to confront everything she had done. With slow, deliberate movements, I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but I could hear the tremor in it. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch out, giving her just enough time to let her mind wander, to let her wonder how deep this betrayal ran, how far I would go to make her pay. Finally, I spoke, my voice cold, like ice. "The pictures you sent, him, the ones you thought you deleted. I have copies. I'm going to make sure he knows. Every detail, every intimate moment you shared with him while you pretended to be my wife." Her eyes widened in horror, the reality of what I was saying crashing into her with the force of a freight train. "No, no, you wouldn't," she stammered, but the disbelief was already fading from her face, replaced with the dawning horror that this wasn't some empty threat. "I would," I said softly, my lips curling into a twisted smile, though there was no joy in it. "And I will. Because you need to feel what it's like to lose everything, to know the pain of betrayal from the one you trusted the most." I could see her breathing quicken, her chest rising and falling with the frantic beat of her heart. She trembled, her hands shaking so badly now that they barely rested on her lap. But even in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. Not anymore. The moments that followed stretched between us like an eternity. Her breath was ragged now, jagged gasps as though she were drowning in the gravity of the situation. But I wasn't drowning. I was rising above the sea of hurt and betrayal, finding an ugly clarity in the storm of my emotions. I watched her, observing how the light from the dim lamp overhead reflected off her face, pale, etched with panic, regret, and the faintest hint of desperation. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered anymore. Not her tears, not her pleas. She had crossed a line, and now she was going to face what that truly meant. My hand hovered over the envelope on the coffee table. I could feel the weight of it, the truth within it, pressing down on me like an anchor, pulling me deeper into the cold, dark waters of my vengeance. She thinks I'll stop, I realized. She thinks I'll relent if she cries hard enough, if she begs enough. But I won't. Not this time. I leaned in close enough to feel her tremble, to hear the small broken sounds she made as her hands clenched desperately in her lap. Her eyes, dark with the realization of what was coming, flickered toward the envelope, and I could see the understanding forming, the weight of that knowledge settling over her. "No," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please, don't do this." I remained silent for a moment, letting her words linger in the air. But I wasn't listening. I was already beyond the point of no return, too deep in the haze of betrayal and rage to care for her regret. She had the chance to come clean, I thought bitterly, to choose me, to choose us. But she hadn't, and now she's going to see how it feels to lose everything. With a swift motion, I pushed the envelope closer to her, the sharp sound of paper against wood filling the air. The tremor in her hand as she reached for it was barely noticeable, but I saw it. I saw the way her fingers shook as she picked it up, as she reluctantly peeled it open. "Don't look," I said softly, my words a low command, laced with something far colder than I'd intended. "Don't look if you don't want to see what you've done. But if you're going to beg for forgiveness, at least know what I know." She glanced down at the pictures inside. Her lips parted in shock, then snapped closed. Her breath hitched, her entire body trembling as she slowly lifted one image from the envelope, her face frozen in horror. The pictures didn't lie. There was nowhere to hide from the truth. The raw, visceral reality of her betrayal was laid bare before us both. I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered, her voice cracking as she looked up at me, her face pale with shame. "I thought I could control it. I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought what?" I asked, my voice low but laced with venom. "You thought you could get away with it? You thought I wouldn't find out? You thought it wouldn't matter?" She bit her lip, her eyes brimming with tears, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. I didn't care about her regret, not now. "You destroyed me, Rachel," I said, each word slow and deliberate, aimed at cutting through the shell of her excuses. "You ruined everything. Every promise, every moment we shared. And for what? For him? For someone else?" She was shaking now, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth, as if to keep the sobs at bay. The guilt was written all over her face, but the damage had already been done. But I wasn't finished. I couldn't be. I had to see this through to the end. "I'm not going to forgive you," I said, my tone final, each word carrying the weight of a verdict. "And I'm not going to let you forget what you did. I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life. I want you to remember the look on my face, the feeling of this, the destruction you caused." I paused, stepping back slightly, taking in the scene, the wreckage of what was left of us. The woman who once promised to be my partner, my equal, now reduced to a trembling, guilt-ridden figure. Her sobs were louder now, her entire body racked with emotion. But I didn't move. She had betrayed me, and now she would bear witness to her own downfall. "I hope it was worth it," I said, my voice softer now, almost cold in its finality. "I hope whatever you had with him was worth losing me, worth destroying everything we built. Because once I walk out that door, Rachel, I'm not coming back." Her gaze snapped to mine then, desperation and fear flashing across her face. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though she were pleading with the last shred of hope. "Please, I'll fix this. I'll make it right. I'll do anything. Just, please." I shook my head slowly, the hurt flooding through me, but this time it was accompanied by something darker, something more final. "You had your chance," I said, "and now it's over." The air was crisp as I walked away from her, the night closing in around me, swallowing the remnants of my actions whole. It wasn't that I was proud of what I'd done. It wasn't about pride, not anymore. It was about survival, about forcing myself to let go of the man I used to be, the man who had loved her, trusted her with his heart. That person was gone now, replaced by something sharper, something colder. I could still feel the warmth of her trembling hands on my skin, the way her touch had once made me feel safe. But now, it was a memory laced with poison, each recollection, a reminder of how deep the betrayal ran. I hadn't expected to feel this detached. I hadn't expected to feel this empty. My footsteps slowed as I reached the street corner. The city lights blurred around me, swirling in a sea of neon and shadow. The world around me felt strangely distant, like I was moving through it with a sort of ghostly clarity. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was going or why, but I didn't care. It doesn't matter anymore. I pulled out my phone, swiping, through the messages that had been left unread. Her name flashed at the top of the screen, Rachel. My thumb hovered over her contact, but I hesitated. Don't do it, I reminded myself. She doesn't deserve anything from you. Not anymore. The desire to reach out, to hear her voice, to hear her apologies, to somehow find some semblance of closure, burned inside me like a fever. But I was smarter now. The anger had given way to something else, something that felt colder, more controlled. I locked the phone and shoved it into my pocket. No more second chances, no more excuses. As I turned the corner, my eyes landed on the distant silhouette of a bar. The dull hum of conversation and music spilled out from inside. A strange draw for my restless mind. I wasn't looking for comfort, wasn't searching for solace in the way people usually did when they were heartbroken. No, I was looking for something else, something darker. I entered without hesitation. The dim lights greeted me like a strange, familiar embrace, and the noise of voices filled the space between my ears. There was a sense of anonymity here, a place where I could lose myself for just a moment, a place where I could shed the skin of what I'd been, and for a brief span of time, become someone else entirely. I slid into a booth in the corner, my back to the wall, my eyes scanning the crowd without really focusing. I could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the soft hum of a jazz song playing over the speakers, but none of it penetrated the shell I'd built around myself. A woman approached the bar, tall and striking, with dark, sleek hair that cascaded down her back in waves. Her posture was confident, assertive, but something about the way she moved, like she knew she didn't belong here but was relishing it, made me pause. For a brief moment, I wondered what it would be like to forget everything, to forget Rachel, forget the lies, the images, the pain, to just slip away into this moment, into the soft, velvet cocoon of distraction. But then the sharp edge of reality sliced through me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. The betrayal was still there, pressing against my chest, clinging to me like a shadow that refused to leave. She caught my gaze then, her eyes meeting mine across the room, with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. There was a faint flicker of recognition in her eyes. Maybe it was the way I carried myself, the way I sat at the edge of the room, detached and watchful. "Hey," she said, sliding into the booth without invitation. "You look like you're in the middle of something complicated." Her voice was low, smooth, an invitation. But I wasn't interested in conversation. Not tonight. I wasn't looking for anything beyond escape. But her presence was like a thread pulling at me, and I found myself responding without thinking. "It's complicated," I murmured, almost absent-mindedly, as I reached for my drink. "Complicated and painful." Her smile was subtle, her lips curling just enough to suggest she understood without pressing further. "I get that. Life doesn't always play nice, does it?" I chuckled darkly, the sound bitter in my throat. "No, it doesn't." The woman leaned forward slightly, her gaze never wavering from mine. "You know, if you want to talk about it, I'm a great listener. But if you want to forget about it for a while, I think I could help with that too." She spoke with a confidence that made it impossible to doubt she was accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. And I wanted to forget, even if just for tonight. I studied her, not out of any real interest, but because her presence was almost magnetic, pulling at the remnants of something inside me that yearned for release. I could feel the tension in my body, the sharp edge of regret, anger, and bitterness gnawing at me. But I also felt something else, the same quiet. The morning after was a slow, quiet ache, a dull throb that pulsed at the back of my mind as the hazy fog of the night before began to recede. The city outside felt colder than usual, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. I hadn't expected to wake up next to her. I hadn't expected to let myself slip into that kind of moment where the world could be forgotten, where I could pretend, just for a few hours, that none of it mattered. But the weight of Rachel's betrayal was still there, still clinging to me, reminding me of who I used to be and who I had become in the wake of it all. The woman beside me stirred, her fingers brushing the edge of my shirt as she shifted in her sleep. She had been easy, too easy. And though I'd allowed myself the distraction, something about the simplicity of it made me feel hollow. I wasn't looking for comfort, and yet I had found it in the one place I never should have. The arms of someone who knew nothing of me, nothing of my past, my pain. She was nothing more than a fleeting echo, a distraction in a night of chaos. I stood up, careful not to wake her, and moved towards the bathroom. The cold tile floor bit into my feet. As I stared at myself in the mirror, my reflection fractured by the tiredness in my eyes. I saw a man who had lost everything, who had been betrayed in a way that would mark him forever. I wasn't sure if I hated myself or if I hated what I had become. The glass of water by the sink trembled slightly in my hand as I drank deeply, the cool liquid doing little to numb the ache inside me. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of something irreversible, something that couldn't be undone. What am I doing? I asked myself, the question gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Is this really what I wanted? But in the back of my mind, there was another voice, a darker one, the one that had been growing stronger with every lie, every betrayal, every broken promise. You're not done yet. I wiped my mouth, leaning against the sink as the weight of it all settled on me. I'll make her pay. I will. The woman in my bed was still asleep when I returned to the room, her body sprawled out across the sheets. I didn't feel anything when I looked at her, nothing beyond the nagging emptiness that gnawed at my chest. She had been a distraction, and now she was just a reminder of how far I had fallen. I needed to focus. I needed to finish this. I grabbed my jacket from the chair, moving quickly, leaving the apartment without a second thought. The streets outside were still bathed in the muted glow of early morning, but they felt cold and distant, as though they, too, were waiting for something that I wasn't sure I could deliver. I pulled out my phone as I walked, the image of Rachel's face flashing in my mind like a scar. She had no idea what was coming, no idea what she had done to me. But she would. It's time, I thought, my fingers flying across the screen as I typed a single message. We need to talk. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before I could allow doubt to creep in. And then I waited. I didn't want to wait. I didn't want to sit in the tension, feel the slow-burning anticipation of what was to come. But I knew it had to happen. The conversation, the confrontation, the reckoning. My phone buzzed a moment later. Her name, Rachel. I didn't hesitate this time. I opened the message. When? Where? The words were simple, but they carried so much weight. She was scared. I could feel it in the shortness of her reply, the urgency behind her words. She wasn't ready for this, but she didn't have a choice. Paused for a moment, the message hovering over my keyboard. Do I meet her at the house? Do I make her come to me? A part of me wanted to see her face when she realized what I had, what I knew. To watch the color drain from her skin, to see the fear take hold of her as the truth finally hit her. But I knew better than to give her that satisfaction. No, I thought, making my decision. I'll make her come to me. I'll control this. I typed my response quickly. Tonight. Same place. I felt a sick thrill at the thought of it. It was happening. The confrontation, the reckoning, the moment when I would make her understand the depth of her betrayal. I turned off my phone, slipping it back into my pocket as I stepped into the busy street, the sounds of the city filling my ears. But nothing could drown out the beating of my own heart. It was erratic now, the rhythm strange and out of sync, like I was out of control, and yet I wasn't. I was in control. One more step, I reminded myself. One more piece of the puzzle. I wasn't finished yet. Rachel wasn't the only one who had something to lose, and tonight I would make sure she knew exactly what it felt like to lose it all. The hours crawled by as the sun dipped lower, the world around me growing more subdued. Yet the fire in my chest only grew brighter, hotter. I could feel the weight of what I was about to do, pressing against my ribs, threatening to burst free. The anticipation thrummed beneath my skin like an electric current, my nerves raw, each breath a slow, deliberate inhale of control. I can't back down now. I stood in front of the mirror again, looking at the man I had become. I could see the change in my eyes, the dark circles under them from the sleepless nights, the tightness in my jaw that had come from months of holding back anger, fear, and betrayal. But there was something else there now, a coldness, a clarity that sharpened the edges of my thoughts, a resolve. I wasn't the man who had once trusted her with my heart. I wasn't the man who had looked at Rachel with love and vulnerability. I had shed that skin long ago. Tonight I wasn't just her husband. I was the man who was going to make her understand the cost of her lies. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, the cold air of the evening biting at my skin as I headed towards the car. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if I was walking towards a precipice I couldn't quite see, but I knew was there. I arrived at the meeting spot, a quiet, secluded cafe on the edge of town. It wasn't a place anyone would go unless they had a reason to, a perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. I sat at the table in the corner, my back to the wall, watching the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. She walked in like she owned the world, just like she always did. The familiar sound of her heels tapping against the floor reached me before I saw her. Rachel. She was dressed in that black dress she knew always made her look flawless, too perfect. Her makeup was impeccable, her hair cascading in soft waves, every strand in place, just as it always was when she wanted to look untouchable. But there was something different in her eyes tonight. Something fragile. She was trying too hard to hide it, but I saw it in the way her lips trembled, the way her shoulders stiffened when she saw me sitting there. She knows, I thought, watching her hesitation as she approached the table. She stopped in front of me, her expression unreadable. But her hands betrayed her. They were clenched at her sides, her fingers tight, digging into the fabric of her coat. "Why did you want to meet?" Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, one that didn't escape my notice. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. The woman who had once held my heart in her hands, the woman who had shattered it without a second thought. I couldn't bring myself to speak right away. I wanted to savor this moment, to see how long she would hold on to the facade, how long she would pretend that none of it was happening. "You think you can fool me again, Rachel?" I didn't say anything at first, simply watching her with a cool, detached gaze. Her face flushed slightly under my scrutiny, but she didn't break. Not yet. "You have no idea how much I've missed. You," she said, and the words felt like they were made of glass. Delicate, fragile. Her attempt to reach out, to pull me back into the web of deceit we'd once shared. I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of affection. It was a smile of recognition. Recognition of the lies, the manipulations, the betrayal. "Missed me?" I repeated softly, leaning forward, my voice low but cutting. "You missed me? After everything? After what you've done?" Her eyes flinched at the words, but she quickly masked it. Though I could see the way her breath hitched, she was unraveling. "James?" she began, her voice shaky now, but she pressed on. I know I've made mistakes. We both have, but no, I interrupted, my voice sharp. You don't get to apologize now. Not after everything. You don't get to walk in here with that look on your face like nothing happened, like you didn't betray me, like you didn't tear apart everything we had. Her face paled as she took a step back, her eyes darting around the cafe as if looking for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The truth was already out, and she could feel it closing in on her. I didn't... She swallowed hard, shaking, her head. I didn't mean to hurt you, I swear. You hurt me, I said, leaning in even closer, watching her flinch at the venom in my tone. And you've been lying to me for so long, Rachel, for years. Her breath caught in her throat, and I saw the weight of my words settle on her. She was choking on them now. She was realizing, just as I had, that the game was over. There was no going back. I know, she whispered, the words barely audible. I know I've hurt you, and I'm so sorry, but it wasn't like that. It wasn't what you think. Stop, I cut her off, shaking my head. No more excuses. No more lies. The coldness in the air seemed to follow me as I walked away from the cafe. The city around me felt distant, the streets echoing with the sound of my footsteps, each one a reminder of the distance I had put between myself and Rachel, between myself and everything I had once believed in. But as I walked, something gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Is this really enough? I had seen her face crumble. I had seen the tears gather in her eyes as I shattered the illusion of control she had so carefully crafted. But even in that moment, as I had left her behind, there was a sense of hollowness, an emptiness that spread through my chest. The satisfaction I thought I would feel, the catharsis I had imagined, was nothing more than a cold whisper in the back of my mind. The truth was, it wasn't over yet. I needed more. It wasn't just about confronting her. It wasn't about seeing her cry or watching her squirm. It was about everything. It was about making her understand that the damage she had done wasn't something she could just erase with an apology. That the years I had spent with her, years I would never get back, were worth more than the lies she had spun. I couldn't let it go. I couldn't let her go. I found myself standing at the edge of the park, the last traces of sunlight fading behind the skyline. The city seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. What do I want? I asked myself, the question lingering in my mind like a ghost. I had been so sure of myself when I had sent her that message, when I had walked into the cafe and laid the truth at her feet. But now, it felt like I had just opened a door to a place I wasn't sure I could leave. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking through the spiral of my thoughts. It was her. Rachel. The message appeared on the screen, but I hesitated before opening it. Do you really want to know what she has to say? I asked myself, the bitter taste of irony lingering in my mouth. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the message. I opened it. I never meant for it to be like this. Please, James, don't walk away. Please, I need you. I stared at the words, the image of her face from earlier flashing through my mind, the trembling lips, the pain in her eyes. There was guilt in her message, but there was something else too. Desperation. I couldn't help but smile bitterly. She wants me to feel sorry for her now, after everything. I could have turned my phone off. I could have ignored it, let the message disappear into nothing. But a part of me wanted to read on. I wanted to see how far she would go to fix this, to make me believe in her again, even if I knew it was pointless. Another message came through. I know I've ruined everything, but I'm begging you, don't end it like this. We can still make it work, James. I'll do anything. Anything. I could hear her voice in my head, pleading, the same way she had so many times before. I could almost see her standing there, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with fear of losing me. But I wasn't the same man who had stood beside her all those years ago. I wasn't the man who had trusted her with everything, who had let her inside my heart. The man who loved her was dead. And the man standing now was someone else entirely. I typed out a response, my fingers moving almost mechanically as I wrote the words that would seal the deal. You can't fix this. You can't make it right. You had your chance. I hit send before I could change my mind. The message felt final, like the closing of a door I couldn't open again, no matter how much I wanted to. No matter how much it hurt. I leaned back against the park bench, staring at the skyline as the darkness of night crept in. The city felt quiet now, distant, but I could still hear the echo of her words in my head, her desperate pleas, her voice breaking with each message. And I wondered, did I want her back? Did I want to go back to what we had before the lies, before the betrayal? But even as the question lingered in my mind, I knew the answer. I couldn't go back. I couldn't pretend that what we had was something worth saving. What was left between us wasn't love. It wasn't trust. It was broken pieces, and I wasn't sure there was anything left worth mending. The phone buzzed again. Another message, but this time I didn't look. I couldn't look. The weight of it was too much. I am done, I thought, pushing away the lingering traces of the man I used to be. I've already moved on. She just doesn't know it yet. I stood up, walking away from the bench. The night was colder now, the city lights flickering like distant stars. But this time I didn't feel the weight of the past pulling at me. I didn't feel the ache of betrayal. I just felt the emptiness, the silence. And in a strange way, it was freeing. I wasn't sure where this road would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer chasing revenge. I was chasing something else. The days that followed were quieter than I had anticipated, the kind of silence that felt like the calm before a storm. Rachel's messages slowed, then stopped entirely, though the occasional flicker of a notification still haunted me. I could feel her desperation, her refusal to let go, pulling at the edges of my consciousness, but I kept my distance. The silence was mine now, not hers. Yet there were moments, fleeting ones, when I found myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for her to appear, for the past to come rushing back in full force. But the world had shifted. I had shifted. And with each passing day, I felt less and less like the man who had been betrayed, the man who had been consumed by rage and a thirst for retribution. Had I really wanted revenge? The thought settled uneasily in my chest. I had thought, in those first moments after confronting her, that this would be the answer, the release I had been craving. But now, as the weeks stretched on and the anger began to fade, I realized something. Revenge had been the easy way out. It was too clean, too final. It didn't touch the raw places inside me that still ached. I didn't want to feel that. I didn't want to let go. I spent my days buried in work, filling the hours with distractions. But when the night came, the quiet would return, and it was in the quiet that I found my mind wandering back to Rachel. The ache, the knot that had formed in my stomach all those years ago when I first discovered her betrayal, still lingered. Could I really leave all that behind? I walked the streets late one evening when the air had cooled and the world felt like it was holding its breath. The city around me seemed to blur, its noises swallowed up by my thoughts. I didn't have a destination, but my feet carried me toward a place I had once known well, the park near our old apartment. It felt strange to be there alone now. The memories of us, of her, filled the air like a ghost. I could almost hear her laughter, see her smile as we walked through this very park, hand in hand. The same place where I had promised myself I would always protect her, always cherish her. But all of it was gone. the love, the promises, the trust. I sat down on the bench, the familiar weight of it underneath me, and looked out at the darkened path stretching ahead. For a moment I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze brush against my face, hoping for some clarity, some understanding. Is this what it all boils down to? I thought, my heart heavy in my chest. A memory of what could have been. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, I heard it. The soft click of heels against the pavement. The unmistakable sound that belonged to Rachel. I turned, my breath catching in my throat as she appeared from the shadows, just as she had so many times before. She looked the same, but there was something different in her eyes now, a vulnerability that hadn't been there the last time. We spoke. She didn't look perfect this time. She looked human, broken. "James," she said softly, her voice wavering in the cool air. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze shifting nervously between me and the ground. She's not here to beg for forgiveness anymore, I realized, the realization coming slowly, as if she, too, had finally reached the point where words no longer held weight. "What are you doing here?" I asked, though the question seemed unnecessary. The truth was, I already knew the answer. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. "I couldn't let you go without saying this," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Not without telling you that I'm sorry. I know it's too late. But I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. I did love you, James. I lost my way." I felt a knot tighten in my chest, the sharp edge of old wounds beginning to throb. The words, the apology. It was all so familiar, like a song I had heard too many times. And yet, this time, it didn't sting. It didn't burn. "I don't know what you expect me to say," I said, my voice calm, even though inside I could feel the old pain flaring up like embers in a forgotten fire. "I don't know what you think is going to change." "I don't want anything from you," she said quickly, her eyes meeting mine, desperate for me to understand. "I just need you to know that I've changed, that I will change, that I can be someone better." I stared at her, taking in the rawness of her words, the weight of the years that had been lost, the anger I had once felt for her, for everything she had taken from me, had softened over time. But it still lingered like a dull ache. It was hard to believe that anything could truly change now. Not for us. Did I want to forgive her? The question hung in the air between us, impossible to answer with certainty. Part of me wanted to feel that release, that sense of peace that only forgiveness could bring. But another part of me, the part that had suffered, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, and I watched the city from my perch on the bench, the lights from the buildings casting a golden glow on the wet pavement. It was a quiet night, a perfect contrast to the storm inside me. Rachel had left, and I could still hear her footsteps in my mind, her words lingering in the air like smoke. She had apologized, but it didn't change anything. There was no undoing the past. No matter how much she had changed, or claimed to change, the damage had already been done. I wasn't angry anymore. I was numb. Numb to the idea of reconciliation, to the notion that we could somehow piece together a life after everything that had shattered. The years we'd spent together had never been as perfect as I had believed them to be. And now, all I was left with was the broken remains of a love that had faded like an old photograph, its edges curling and yellowing with time. I thought about what Rachel had said, that she didn't expect forgiveness. Was she right? Could I ever truly forgive her for what she'd done? The deceit, the lies, the betrayal? I couldn't say. But one thing was certain. I didn't need her forgiveness. I didn't need anyone's validation anymore. What I needed was to find something within myself that was worth holding on to. I had spent so much of my life trying to hold on to something I'd lost, a dream that had died along with trust. But that night, in the stillness of the city, I realized that I had spent too long searching for answers that didn't exist. There was no revenge that would bring me peace. There was no satisfaction to be found in watching her squirm, in making her feel what I had felt. Instead, I needed something else, something deeper. As I stood up from the bench, the decision settled in my chest like a quiet resolution. I am done with this, done with the past. I walked away from the park, not looking back, but knowing that the darkness behind me would never fully disappear. It would always be a part of me. The betrayal, the pain, the rage. But it didn't have to control me. Not anymore. I returned to my apartment, the familiar door creaking as I stepped inside. The space was quiet, empty in a way that had never seemed so final. The walls felt as though they were closing in, but I welcomed it. It was time to face the silence. I poured myself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light from the lamp above. I drank it slowly, savoring the burn, the way it washed over me like a baptism of sorts. There was no going back, no more chasing, ghosts, no more revenge. The past was a shadow now, and I would walk toward the light. But as I set the glass down on the table, I heard the sound of my phone vibrating on the counter. My heart clenched for a brief second, and then I saw the name flashing across the screen. Rachel. I hesitated. It would have been so easy to ignore it, to block her out completely and let the past fade away in silence. But something inside me, something I couldn't quite name, urged me to answer. I picked up the phone. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly as though she had been crying. "Please, just hear me out. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need to try. For myself." I closed my eyes for a moment, the weight of her voice settling over me like a heavy blanket. She sounded genuine, genuinely lost, genuinely sorry. But it didn't change the truth. I couldn't go back to who I had been. I couldn't pretend that what she had done hadn't torn something deep within me. "Rachel," I said, my voice steady, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth, "I don't think you understand. It's not about fixing anything anymore. It's not about us. It's about me, about finding myself again. I've spent too long holding on to what we had, trying to make it right, when maybe it was never meant to be." There was a pause, a long one before she spoke again. Her voice was small, fragile, as though it might break if she said too much. "I understand," she whispered, and for a moment, I thought I could hear the echo of regret in her words. But it wasn't enough. "I need you to let me go," I continued, my tone soft but firm. "You need to let me go." Another silence, and then a quiet, almost defeated, "Okay." The phone clicked off, and I sat there in the silence of the apartment. The weight of that conversation settled over me, heavier than I had expected. Part of me wanted to reach out, to tell her that I didn't mean to be harsh, that I wasn't trying to hurt her. But I knew better now. I knew that sometimes saying the truth was the only way to move forward, for both of us. And so I sat there, the city outside dark and still, the night stretching on like a road I had yet to walk. I had taken the first step. I had broken free of the need for vengeance, for closure. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about me. The days that followed felt like a slow, methodical unraveling. My world no longer felt chaotic, but it also didn't feel peaceful. There was a starkness to it, as though I had entered a new phase of my life, but hadn't fully adjusted to the shift. The days stretched on, gray and heavy, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to fill the void. I'd told myself that I was done, that Rachel's departure, her apology, the closure that I had, desperately sought in my darkest moments, were enough to free me. But in the quiet spaces of my mind, I felt it, this gnawing emptiness, an absence that wasn't easily filled. I threw myself into my work, but there were times, late at night, when the distractions couldn't mask the sharp pangs of longing. Not for her, no, not Rachel, but for the life I thought I was supposed to have, for the future I had built with her in my mind. I had chased a vision of happiness, of stability, of love, only to watch it crumble in front of me. And while I could walk away from Rachel, the broken dream remained. And so the ache persisted, just beneath the surface, like a bruise that refused to fade. It was during one of these late-night moments, when the silence of the apartment became too suffocating, that I received another message. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Sarah. Sarah. She was someone I hadn't thought about in years, a friend from my past, someone I had once shared a connection with before everything had turned upside down. We'd lost touch after Rachel and I had settled into our life together, but Sarah had always held a piece of my history, the kind of history that no one else knew, before the betrayal, before the ruin. I hadn't expected to hear from her again, not after all that had happened. But there it was, her name, a reminder of a time before everything had changed. Her message was simple, just a few words. I know you're hurting, but you don't have to do this alone. It was enough to send a ripple of emotion through me. There was something in her words, in the vulnerability they carried, that made me pause. Something in her voice, even through the digital silence, that felt like a tether to a past where things had been simpler, less complicated. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Was I really ready for this? I had promised myself I wouldn't go back. I had promised myself I would move on. But something about the message gnawed at me, the gentle pull of an old connection that had never fully unraveled. I typed back, my fingers trembling slightly as the words formed. What do you mean? Seconds passed, and then her reply came. I know what happened. I know about Rachel. And I know that you're holding something inside. I'm not here to push you, but I'm here if you need someone. I always will be. Her words struck a chord deep within me. She wasn't pushing me, not asking for anything more than my honesty, but her presence, her understanding, felt like a bridge to something I had lost. The thing about betrayal, the thing I hadn't quite anticipated, was how it didn't just ruin your relationship. It fractured everything. It made you question your own ability to trust, your capacity for connection. But here, in her words, there was no judgment, no expectations, just understanding. And so, without overthinking it, I found myself typing back. How about we meet? The reply was almost immediate. I'll be there in an hour. When Sarah arrived, it was like stepping back in time. She hadn't changed much. Still the same warmth in her eyes, the same quiet strength. The years hadn't erased the bond we shared, and as we sat in my living room, the silence between us felt comfortable, familiar. How are you, James? She asked softly, her gaze steady but filled with concern. I exhaled slowly, the weight of everything I'd carried pressing on me, but the words didn't come immediately. I wasn't sure I could articulate how I felt anymore. It was a blur of anger, sadness, confusion, and, somewhere deep inside, a tiny spark of something I couldn't name. Hope, maybe. A longing for something more than the emptiness I'd been existing in. I'm surviving, I finally said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. I thought I had everything figured out, that I could just let go, that it would be enough. But nothing really feels the same anymore. She nodded as if she understood. Her eyes didn't leave mine, and in the stillness of the room, I felt the weight of her presence. Familiar, comforting, yet sharp in its reminder of everything I had lost. "I know it's not easy," Sarah said after a long pause, "but you're not alone in this. You don't have to carry all of it by yourself." The simplicity of her words, the genuine care she expressed, made something in me crack. A flood of emotions rose to the surface: grief, relief, longing, but most of all, rage. Not toward Rachel, not anymore. The weeks passed in a blur of silent transformation. Each day a quiet step toward healing, toward regaining a sense of self that had been lost amidst the wreckage of betrayal. The weight in my chest, though still there, had lightened. And yet, something lingered, a restlessness that clawed at the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that I wasn't quite done with it all. Not yet. It wasn't just about letting go anymore. It wasn't just about moving on from Rachel or the broken pieces of the life we once shared. It was about something deeper, something more insidious, the need to feel something again. Anger. A desire for closure. Perhaps even the desire for justice, although I hadn't fully admitted that to myself. I could feel the tension building inside of me, but it wasn't the kind of anger that burned with rage. It was quieter, more controlled, like the simmering embers of a fire that had long since been doused, yet still left the air thick with heat. I found myself pacing more often, walking the city streets late at night, hands buried deep in my pockets, shoulders tense with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Sarah, in her quiet wisdom, had kept her distance, but her presence still lingered in my life like a comforting shadow. I no longer felt the overwhelming urge to call her every night or seek solace in her company, but I could feel the steady anchor she had become in my life. She was a tether to reality, pulling me back when I felt myself floating into darker waters. One particular evening, I found myself sitting in my usual place, alone in a dimly lit bar, nursing a glass of whiskey that had long since gone warm. The dull hum of conversation around me, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of jazz playing. From the speakers, all felt distant, as though I were trapped in a moment suspended in time. And then, just as I was about to take another sip, my phone buzzed. The name that flashed across the screen made my pulse spike. Rachel. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, not since the night we'd spoken. Her apology, her promise to leave, me alone, had been so final, so complete. I had assumed she had moved on just as I had tried to, but now there it was, her name, and a message that, when I read it, sent an unexpected chill down my spine. "I need to talk. I messed up. Can you meet me tomorrow?" For a moment, I sat still, the glass of whiskey pressed against my lips but forgotten, its burn no longer felt. A swirl of emotions, fear, anger, curiosity, flashed through me. Why was she reaching out again? The resentment I thought I'd buried flared up in an instant. Was this a game to her? Or was she just unable to let go of the control, the manipulation, the lies? I didn't know what she wanted, but I did know one thing. I wasn't going to let this chance slip by. "I'll be there," I typed. The words cool and calculated, a response that felt detached from the storm of thoughts inside me. The next day, I found myself standing in front of a small cafe, the kind that had no real personality beyond its old-fashioned decor and the scent of stale coffee that seemed to cling to the air. Rachel was already there, sitting at a table near the window. Her appearance hadn't changed much. Still the same honey-brown hair, still the same slender figure, though there was a certain fragility in her posture today, something that wasn't there before. She wore a soft, cream-colored sweater, one that clung to her frame, and the way she looked at me when I approached seemed almost desperate. "James," she said, her voice thin, almost breaking. I didn't know who else to turn to. I took a seat across from her without a word, my eyes scanning her face, looking for any trace of sincerity, any sign that she understood the damage she had caused. "I'm listening," I said, my voice flat, neutral. The silence between us was thick, heavy with the unspoken history we shared. Rachel shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup absently. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see how wrong I was." The words fell from her lips, but they didn't move me. I had heard them before, too many times. They had lost their meaning the moment she made the decision to betray me. What was the point of apologies now after everything? I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I fixed her with a steady gaze. "Why now? After everything? After you walked away? After you told me you were done?" Rachel flinched at my words, her eyes darting to the table before meeting my gaze again, this time with tears shining in the corners of her eyes. I couldn't live with myself anymore. I lied to you, James, and I lied to myself. I'm sorry. I've been seeing someone else, but it's over. I ended it." The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I was still. I wasn't angry, not right away. I was simply numb. The words didn't shock me. The days after Rachel's visit passed like a slow river, each moment dragging me further away from the man I used to be. It was as if the layers of who I had once been, the person I had crafted through years of marriage, had slowly started to peel away, leaving only the raw, exposed parts behind. The anger had finally drained, leaving a cold, hollow emptiness. There were no more desperate attempts to rebuild what couldn't be fixed. No more righteous indignation filling the gaps where betrayal had once festered. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice something. Something small at first, but growing with every passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel's shadow was still looming over me, even though she was physically absent from my life. It was subtle at first. Little things that made my skin prickle with discomfort. A change in her schedule. Late nights at work that seemed longer than they should. She had started to retreat back into herself, becoming more distant, more withdrawn. Her once open demeanor had turned cold, almost calculating. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that perhaps I was just hyper-aware after everything that had happened. But that gnawing sensation, the one that warned me something wasn't right, refused to let me be. And then, the small clues started to accumulate. I found the first one. On a Tuesday evening when I went to her closet to grab my jacket. Her phone, face down on the bed, buzzed 3 times in quick succession. A soft, almost imperceptible vibration, but it was enough to catch my attention. I hesitated. There was no reason for me to look at her phone anymore. I had sworn to myself that I wouldn't invade her privacy. But as the buzz of the notifications continued, that old, twisted curiosity, the same curiosity that had driven me to the brink during the first betrayal, crept in. I glanced at the phone. The screen was locked, but beneath it, there were enough details visible in the notifications to make my stomach tighten. The name of the person messaging her was familiar. James. But not the James I knew. This one had a last name that I didn't recognize, a stranger's name, and it was the intimacy of the conversation that made my blood run cold. "I can't wait to see you again tonight. It feels like we've been apart for far too long." My breath caught in my throat. The pieces clicked into place almost too quickly. Her strange late nights, her withdrawn demeanor, the inexplicable distance between us. It was all coming back to the surface, and this time, there was no denial. She was doing it again. For the second time, my wife was betraying me. I stood there, staring at the phone, as the weight of this new reality pressed down on me. The house felt suddenly too quiet, too still. The blood in my veins felt sluggish, like I was moving through quicksand, every step heavy and deliberate. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Part of me was furious, ready to explode with the same rage that had burned through me when I had first discovered her affair. Another part of me was numb, almost resigned to the fact that the woman I had married, the woman I thought I could trust, had once again shattered the fragile peace we had managed to rebuild. But in that moment, standing in the quiet of the room, I also felt something else. A strange, cold sense of finality. This time, I wasn't going to let it break me. The next morning, Rachel was gone by the time I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold, untouched. A faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, mingling with the sharp tang of coffee in the kitchen. I moved through the house mechanically, as if on autopilot. The routine I had fallen into after the first betrayal, waking up, getting dressed, making coffee, felt like a mask I wore. Nothing felt real anymore. It was all a performance, a hollow existence to mask the quiet destruction happening underneath. I spent most of the day trying to push the thoughts of her betrayal aside, trying to focus on the mundane, the trivial. But as the day wore on, I found myself circling back to the same inevitable question. What was I going to do about it? Rachel's phone buzzed again that evening when I was alone in the living room. I could hear it from the other room, a soft vibration against the surface of the coffee table. I felt my pulse spike. I didn't want to check it again. I had already seen enough, hadn't I? But the same relentless compulsion surged through me. The need for clarity. The need to confront the truth, no matter how much it burned. I grabbed the phone, picking it up slowly, deliberately, as if I was opening a door to something I couldn't undo. The notifications were waiting, as if they had been planted there, ready to show me everything I needed to know. This time, the messages were more explicit, more undeniable. I'll be there at 8 tonight. The house felt colder, quieter, as Rachel stood frozen in front of me, the weight of my words hanging between us like a thick, suffocating fog. The silence stretched, unbearable. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The flicker of guilt in her eyes was all she could muster. The apology she couldn't bring herself to vocalize, the remorse that seemed to suffocate under the pressure of her lies. My heart, once so tangled in a desperate hope for reconciliation, now beat steadily, detached, as I watched her in the dim light of the living room. The woman who had once been my partner, my equal, was now nothing more than a shadow of someone I thought I knew, a ghost walking through the ruins of what we had built. The anger I had harbored earlier had faded into something else, an eerie calm that came with the realization that this moment was inevitable. I knew this would happen again. I knew it. I had been lying to myself for so long, pretending that the scars of the first betrayal had healed, pretending that time had made me stronger. But no amount of time could erase the truth, and that truth was that I had been a fool to ever believe things could be different. I watched as Rachel slowly sank into the couch, her face pale, her hands trembling. She looked at the phone, then back at me, but she couldn't meet my eyes for long. The weight of her guilt seemed to crush her, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to erase the years of deception. It wasn't enough to make me forget the bitterness of betrayal that now had embedded itself deep in my soul. "I'm sorry, James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you like this." I stared at her, letting the silence do the talking for me. "No, you meant every bit of it." I didn't trust my voice to speak, and I didn't need to. There was nothing she could say now that would make any difference. The mask had slipped too many times. The lies were too many to count. I took a long, steady breath, then moved toward the door. I had to leave. I had to get away from her, from this house that now felt like a prison. Her voice stopped me just as I reached the threshold. "James, please don't leave me. I swear I'll do anything. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake." The desperation in her voice echoed through the empty space of the room. She was begging now. The woman who had once been so confident, so self-assured, now reduced to this. A woman desperate for forgiveness, yet unable to offer me anything but empty words. I turned slowly, looking at her for the last time. The woman who had been my wife. The one I had loved more deeply than I ever thought possible. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I was numb. "You've had your chances," I said quietly. "And you've wasted every single one of them." I didn't wait for her to respond. I couldn't. I didn't trust myself not to break down if I did. Instead, I walked out of the door and into the night, leaving Rachel behind, her sobs echoing. Through the house, like the distant cry of something lost. The next few days were a blur. The house felt colder without her, the silence louder. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the world itself had paused to let the finality of the moment settle in. But I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. Instead, I felt emptier than I had before. What was I supposed to do now? I had taken the necessary step, made the decision that would supposedly bring closure, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like an ending that didn't offer the peace I had hoped for. I had cut her out, but in doing so, I had cut out a part of myself too. The part that had believed in her, the part that had loved her unconditionally. I found myself back in the same bar I had frequented before, nursing a glass of whiskey as I stared into the amber liquid, lost in thought. The clink of glasses and the quiet hum of conversation around me felt distant, as though I were underwater, disconnected from the world. The weight of my decisions settled heavily on my shoulders. Was it worth it? Was the revenge I had sought, the closure I had craved, worth the cost of what it had cost me? I couldn't answer that yet. But as I sat there, I realized something. My anger was gone, yes, but so was my fear. I had been afraid of losing everything for so long, afraid of the pain, afraid of being alone. But now, as I sat in that bar, I understood that the pain I had feared was nothing compared to the damage of continuing to live in the shadow of someone who had betrayed me. I had freed myself. The following weeks were spent in a haze of quiet reflection. Rachel moved out of the house, leaving behind her things in neat piles, her absence echoing through every room. I had no idea where she went or what she was doing, and I didn't care anymore. She was gone, and that was enough for me. But with her departure came a strange sense of finality, one that made me realize just how much of my life had been defined by her. The days after receiving Rachel's letter were quieter than I had anticipated, yet more profound. It wasn't that the weight of her words had been lifted off me. Rather, the letter had finally given me a sense of clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. I had spent months pretending I didn't need closure, telling myself that leaving her behind, cutting her out of my life, would be enough to heal the wound she had caused. But her letter, simple yet genuine, showed me something I couldn't deny anymore. She was human. She had suffered, too, in her own way, and perhaps the guilt she carried would haunt her for the rest of her life. I put the letter aside for a while, not knowing exactly what to do with it. But as the days went by, I felt myself moving towards something new, a space where I could breathe, where I could finally ask myself what I wanted, and more importantly, who I had become in the aftermath of everything. The devastation, the anger, the numbness had slowly started to fade, and in its place was a stirring, faint but growing of hope. Hope that I could find something more for myself, something better than I had been willing to accept before. There were mornings when I awoke and felt the heavy absence of Rachel's presence, the empty side of the bed where she once lay, but it didn't suffocate me anymore. It didn't twist my gut. I began to recognize the solitude as a space for me to rediscover who I was, before the heartache, before the betrayals. I started to do things that nourished my soul again, things I had forgotten I enjoyed during the years of our marriage. I read books in the early morning light, losing myself in stories that weren't mine. I found solace in cooking, experimenting with flavors and textures I had once loved but hadn't the time or energy to embrace. The quiet became a companion, and I grew to appreciate it in ways I hadn't before. But it was the evenings that held the most significance. I found myself walking at dusk, not in sadness, but in reflection. The orange and purple hues of the sky reminding me that life moved forward, regardless of the past. I walked alone, just my thoughts and the steady rhythm of my feet against the pavement, breathing in the cool air of the evening. I'd often pass the places we'd once frequented. Restaurants, parks, the little coffee shop where we'd shared. So many moments, laughing and dreaming. Those places didn't hold the same weight anymore. They weren't reminders of my failure, of my weakness. Instead, they became markers of a past that was no longer mine to carry. Somewhere along these walks, I began to sense a strange kind of peace, one that wasn't born from closure, but from acceptance. Accepting that everything had happened as it was meant to, even the painful parts. I realized that I had been clinging to a version of myself that no longer existed. The man who had tried, desperately, to fix something that couldn't be fixed. The man who had believed that love could conquer everything. But now, I had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough to make someone faithful. That trust, once broken, could never truly be restored, and that I was worth more than living in the shadows of someone else's mistakes. Weeks passed. I began to step back into the world, gradually letting go of the protective shell I had built around myself. I started to take interest in new things, new friendships, new projects. I opened myself up again, cautiously, but with the understanding that I deserved the kind of connection that had once eluded me. I wasn't looking for a savior or someone to fill the void Rachel had left. I simply wanted to exist in a space where I could thrive, where I could choose who I allowed into my life. Then, one night, I received an unexpected phone call. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something in me told me to answer. Hello? The voice on the other end was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. It was calm, a little tired, but unmistakably Rachel's. James, she began softly, as though she were testing the waters, unsure if I would even hear her out. I didn't expect you to pick up. I just wanted to hear your voice. The familiarity of it shook me. The emotions I thought had been buried under layers of time and distance were now bubbling up to the surface. I felt a strange pang in my chest. I had wondered, in the quiet moments, what she might sound like now, how she might look if I ever saw her again. But I wasn't prepared for this. "What do you want, Rachel?" I asked, the words coming out, more coldly than I had intended. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I had simply moved on. "I know I've ruined everything, and I don't expect anything from you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted to hear your forgiveness. I wanted you to know that I'm not the same person I was before. I've been going to therapy. I'm trying to be better for myself and for anyone who might come into my life.